Okay, so without any further ado, welcome to you all for joining us this evening for the annual CIPR Midlands lecture at the University of Wolverhampton. And we are thrilled to have Katrina Marshall with us here this evening. Katrina is a founding member of the PRCA's Race and Ethnicity Equity Board, and she's a frequent conference speaker on the issues of diversity, equality and inclusion. So we are thrilled that she has come to speak with us this evening. This is the second in our series of events, part of the CIPR Midlands Sustainability of Communications Festival. My name is Sarah Williams and I am the Associate Director of the Business School, and I am also the Secretary of the CIPR Midlands Group. And it is my pleasure to bring you this evening's lecture. Katrina is a well-known speaker on the issues of equality, diversity and inclusion, and I know that this evening's lecture will be both enjoyable and challenging, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say. So without any further ado, I will hand over to you, Katrina. Just to let everybody know, this event is being recorded. It is a public platform. We are using Zoom this evening, so please don't share any private information in the chat. We will have a questions and answers at the end of this evening's lecture. So if you have any questions for Katrina, if you just pop them in the chat, and Katrina and I will go through all of your questions at the end of the session. So I will now introduce Katrina and welcome you here to the University of Wolverhampton. Katrina, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to everyone who logged on today. I think Sarah's kind of set me up a little bit with these high expectations, but I'm going to try. So good evening, and thank you to the CIPR Midlands team and the University of Wolverhampton for the invitation to chat with you. Whether or not they've logged on, I just want to publicly recognize the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Business and Social Sciences, Michael Barden, and the Director of Business School, Professor Claire Schofield. As they say, protocol having been established, let's get to it. So just shy of a year ago, I moved to Bonnie, Birmingham to take up a short contract in Solihull. Strolling around the city and getting to know the old girl, as you do, the collective anticipation of the city hosting the upcoming Commonwealth Games was palpable. And as I prepared for this talk, I immediately began to see the parallels between the aspiration of the Commonwealth itself and the reality of the countries that make up its membership. Let's talk a little bit about what the modern Commonwealth actually means. Since 1949, independent countries from Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and the Pacific have joined the Commonwealth membership. And today, the membership is based on free and equal voluntary cooperation. The last two countries to join the Commonwealth, Rwanda and Mozambique, have no historical ties to the British Empire. In addition to this definition, 32 of the Commonwealth members are deemed small states, which are most likely to be affected by climate change and sharp developmental shifts. Now, it cannot have escaped your notice that the vast majority of the Commonwealth member countries are populated in the main by Black and Brown people. There are infinite languages, regional dialects, and cultural markers that further stratify those populations even within their own borders. On top of that, the small states most vulnerable to climate change, that are Black majority populations, inevitably cash the check written by the G8 and the G20 countries with regard to Brexit, climate change, shifts in global trade, and most recently, as if all that wasn't enough, the Ever Given, the ship that ran aground in the Suez Canal a few months ago. My own home country, Barbados, continues to experience delays in imports as a ripple effect of that hiccup in global trade. So it is both sad and ironic that mostly the descendants of and citizens of the modern Commonwealth traditionally get such short shrift, despite pockets of earnest progress from the industry to which we have all dedicated our time, talents, and efforts. The cruel reality is that while mine and others' individual experiences with the worst excesses of racism in communications and public relations are rare, the structures that create cliques, teams, and nigh on unimpenetrable societies that require Masonic levels of invitation to get in and to this sector in the first place, continue to cut off access to the industry's common wealth. It is not lost on me that I speak to you 1 year and 2 days after the murder by police of George Floyd, whose death in the middle of an already crippling global pandemic and the unrest that followed is likely the only reason I'm speaking to you now. The black squares on Instagram for Blackout Tuesday, the appointment of diversity czars, the big brands making bold statements with ice cream logos, shout out to my friends at Ben & Jerry's. They were all tearing their clothes in some pretty embarrassing demonstrations of corporate self-flagellation. There's now an automatic use of video recordings for what begin as often the most banal interactions between Black people and white people. These were all predicated by this perfect racial storm. It put race relations in the crosshairs of public discourse, from Hackney to Hungary and all the places in between. Many scrambled to appear relevant and on trend, which means people like me, who have always been Black, have always been storytellers, have always been equipped with a working understanding of race relations in class-conscious Britain, suddenly have the word expert used in our titles and are asked to appear on the increasingly exhausting platforms to trot out our trauma for either marketing or education, as if racism is brand new. Indeed, the first task we set ourselves over in the Public Relations and Communications Association's Race, Ethnicity and Equity Board was to put our own house in order. Because even as communicators proved themselves to be essential workers during the pandemic, they were then called upon to manage the reputational and brand impact of issues surrounding the race post George Floyd. Many brands were caught napping and with their pants down. And when we examined the PRCA hierarchy, we found that it looked, as one activist called it, like a sloppily poured pint of Guinness. A mishmash of Black and brown folk through the organization's rank and file, but senior management remained as white as driven snow. Since then, 2 white board members have stepped down and their places are now filled by eminently competent brown people, one of whom is our chair, Barbara Phillips, and the diversification of the board for the first time in its history continues. The Race and Ethnicity Board is also a standing committee, so we can't be brushed aside when this moment in time has passed in favor of a committee that tackles issues more in line with what is trending at the time. What demonstrated how much work we had to do as a board was when we realized that the criteria for being on the PRCA Board of Management was closely tied to something else that needs to be systematically tackled, the ethnicity pay gap. So hear me out for a minute. When your Black and brown employees, who themselves represent a wide range of intersectional protected characteristics, are paid less than their white counterparts, you are denying our industry at large access to their common wealth of cultural understanding, nuance of language, and diverse perspectives. If the criteria for membership bodies is to be the owner or director of an agency, in an industry where Black people don't have an easy in the first place, and then are paid less than their white colleagues, and are then faced with bias, whether conscious or otherwise, how do you expect the industry to evolve if people from minority backgrounds are neither hired, nor retained, nor incentivized to lead their organizations? If they are not leaders, they are not invited to exclusive clubs for leaders. If they are not there, they cannot change the narratives about the industry to make it more accessible. If the industry cannot be accessed by a more diverse cohort of entrants at all stages of their careers, is it any wonder a year on the skepticism over lasting change coming out of last year's race protests is as high as it was then? Data, in fact, shows that many of the promises and much of the money that was pledged to create equity and fairness in the plight of Black people have not materialized. Since then, Black and other ethnic minority groups in Britain have had their lived experiences utterly denied and discredited by the Sewell report, which astonishingly concluded that systematic racism does not exist in the UK. Even more galling was the assertion that Britain should be held up as an exemplar of racial diversity. Don't make me laugh. Predictably, the pushback on those conclusions was swift and fierce. Even the historically even-tempered United Nations weighed in to say, you've got it wrong there, folks. It would be easy to brush this aside as another toothless stack of paper that will be relegated to the dusty corners of history. Here's the problem. For people who look and sound like me, the entire report legitimizes the racist narrative that we've nothing to complain about. So if this is the government's position, and assuming that that flawed assessment will trickle down to institutions like the police, care, fire, and emergency, the umbrella bodies and industry leaders like the CIPR will have to set to working on fashioning the industry in a more diverse image. It will mean facing uncomfortable truths, and instead of resting on tired old excuses like such and such isn't a very diverse area, or we can't seem to attract diverse talent, roll up your sleeves and meet them where they are at. Find them at career showcases and sign up for reverse mentoring. There's no sense waiting on the government. It is clearly not leading the diversity charge in a meaningful way. Indeed, noted academic and author of The New Age of Empire, Professor Kehinde Andrews' rage was palpable as he marked the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. In an opinion piece for Make It Plain, he growled, "Far more damaging and eye-rolling inducing than the howling wolves of racism is the passive-aggressive faux concern of the smiling foxes." He said, "If I see one more Black Lives Matter statement posted from a deeply racist institution, I will either throw up or have been pushed so far over the edge, I will fall into stereotypes and unleash some full-on Black rage." The rest of what he said, I won't repeat in polite company. Slide 13, Sarah. Earlier, I mentioned that I moved to Birmingham to take up a position at Solihull Metropolitan Borough Council. In that capacity, I acted as liaison between Public Health England specialists and the communications team to create joined up and seamless messaging across sectors and interest groups as part of the COVID war effort. One of the most jarring phrases I heard and subsequently pushed back on was that we were attempting to get to hard to reach communities. So at first I thought, okay, everyone's tired. They've been at this for months. And as we heard from Dominic Cummings yesterday, the Prime Minister changed his mind 10 times a day as it is, let alone what local government was expected to do. So lazy terminology is kind of bound to slip in where people feel safe and comfortable. That was my first instinct. But then the higher up the chain of superiority the meetings went, and the more that what was discussed evolved into official communications, I realized the term wasn't being swapped out for anything else. So my question was, hard to reach for whom? The people they socialize with know how to find them. The people who help shape their opinions know how to reach them. The people who they buy from know where to find them to sell to them. The people who help shape their opinions know where to reach them, and they're part of very well-connected communities spanning Birmingham, Sandwell, and Solihull. So why do we keep calling them that? Of course, no one had an answer. And in the first few months of my contract there, it was acknowledged that the council had been historically poor at reaching Pakistani, Bengali, and West African communities, as well as those from the Caribbean, like my family. But as the months wore on and I presented plan after plan and strategy after strategy, engaging well-connected opinion leaders in those communities, which were albeit small, to tailor messaging to increase COVID restrictions compliance, every excuse was used not to roll them out. As it stands, the graphic I designed depicting a Sikh father walking his child in a pram took about 16 rounds of approvals and was only tentatively agreed to. Yet, on the other hand, members of the combined authorities I worked with whipped themselves into an almighty lather, doing focus groups and community outreach for that particular demographic. Yet, the most basic interactions, a conversation with the guy who runs the local chip shop, or an imam from the nearest mosque, no one had asked anyone in these communities a direct question. An eye-watering amount of money was spent on agencies to run surveys and focus groups and meetings and crunch numbers which were proudly shown off at weekly Gold Command meetings. In my assessment, it was a largely performative and box-ticking exercise. Now, I've lived in the UK for off and on about 10 years. So I learned a long time ago that the only social faux pas worse than tardiness is criticizing one of three things: the NHS, the royal family, or local government. However, I have to call a spade a shovel. There were people making decisions for what they perceived to be a monolithic or othered group of people without once consulting them. That being said, the reality is the common wealth of the Asian and Caribbean communities who lived in Birmingham but worked in Solihull was completely missed, and was, in my view, this neglect was the direct cause of the high degree of non-compliance and skepticism our officers on the ground faced when outreach programs were rolled out. Now, some would say that that is more a reflection of the local government dynamic than an indication or fear of bias in the communications industry. I will leave which one it is to you. So by contrast, not too far away, there's a school in Selly Oak which is celebrating and encouraging access to the common wealth of its students and their backgrounds. Up to 70% of the children at the Watermill Primary School don't have English as a first language. In 15 years' time, some of these students may come knocking on the door of our industry, bursting with ideas that challenge, inspire, and revolutionize. My question to you is, what will you have done to ensure that if they do choose comms and PR as a profession, they don't face classist, racist, or sexist barriers to entry, and further are incentivized to stay and guided up the leadership ladder? Are you setting yourself and this industry up for success to access the common wealth of those students and the perspectives they will bring when they come of age? Earlier, I mentioned the intersectionality of protected characteristics. For example, some of your closeted gay new entrants who've just left university will also be immigrants. Some of your mid-career PR practitioners will have a hearing impairment. Some of your Vietnamese senior staff will be gripped with a crisis of conscience when they must uphold traditional values at home and then cringe at the missteps you make when designing a campaign that is meant to promote multiculturalism, but in reality, botches the cultural representation. And why would they say nothing? Because they know they are the only one and will not be taken seriously when challenged. Because their salary supports a grandmother, a mother, and two cousins who speak no English, and they can't afford to lose their job. So in comms, as we know, what is measured can be managed. And more than ever, we are driven by metrics to tell us how we're doing. The magazine Gay Times reported just last night that a Finnish study has offered evidence to suggest companies that implement LGBTQ-friendly policies are likely to be better off financially. But the most telling outcome of the report for me reads as follows. While taking a public stand on potentially sensitive social or political issues may lead to positive outcomes and competitive advantages, the repercussions of social advocacy can also be detrimental if the stance taken is not aligned with the preferences and values of the firm's key stakeholders. Plainly put, if you're engaging in pinkwashing or corporate window dressing, you will quickly be found out and it's going to backfire. Bearing out the results of this study and supported by activists in the UK, this morning's headlines featured a robust call from former senior government advisor Simon Woolley to make it mandatory for companies to disclose their ethnicity gap. Unlike gender pay gap reporting, it is not a legal requirement to publish pay-related data based on ethnicity or race. Now, Mr. Woolley concedes that this is not a silver bullet, but he does assert that your company will be more vibrant if there are people being paid what they're worth. Now, somewhere in between, there is a little bit of a mention. I suppose that's what I was asked to do when I was asked to create a little bit of a blurb. So I talk about where the personal meets the professional, and that's what I'd like to talk about here. If you approach writing a story, advising a client, or creating a strategy or report from only one perspective, the one that you quite fairly were raised and socialized to have, you do your audiences, the public, and your clients a disservice. I like to think of all of us as storytellers. Some of us do it with clicks, some of us do it with words. I used to do it with pictures when I worked in television, but fundamentally, whether it's a client narrative or a press release, we're telling stories. So by having a narrow view from which we do our work, we are vacating our responsibility to educate, inform, enlighten, and entertain the people we serve. What's worse is that when you've been fed one narrative and one narrative only, you don't even know to question what you are told and led to understand as fact. And child, don't get me started on the bias within artificial intelligence, which in things like facial recognition software has been proven to have been designed to recognize mostly white faces. The bias is built into the algorithm because the algorithm is written by people who have built it in their own image. Again, because the system within which they work has evolved from one in which whiteness is centered as normal and every other race as other or abnormal, and no one in the process even thought to challenge it. Now, here's where I'm afraid that is about as far as I'm willing to go to allow for unconscious or subconscious or any other kind of bias to be used as a reason for barriers to inclusion in PR and comms. Far too many people are still treating diversity, equity, and inclusion as a business deliverable only. Something that sits with what was once called corporate social responsibility, but which has now been taken over by its shiny new big sister, ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations. Born out of a need to categorize the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the debate over where ESG should sit and whether comms should lead it rages on over in that scary place that so many of us spend time called the Twitter sphere. However, what cannot be ignored is that people and interpersonal relationships continue to be at the heart of those considerations. So let's go through a few of them so that you can get an idea of what I mean. For example, the third SDG is good health and well-being. Now, if you as a CEO or even as a line manager, and this is just an example, if you only consider the health and well-being of employees who drive to work and can afford parking, or heaven forbid, London's congestion charge or fuel surcharge, if you do that and don't consider the psychological toll a 2-hour commute on 2 buses and a train takes on other team members, then your personal convictions and your professional ones are at odds. If your organization's annual leave form only gives space for Christian holidays like Christmas or Easter, and no paid leave is available for Passover, Holi, Diwali, or Eid, even if there is only one person who is of a different faith on your team, then your personal convictions and your professional commitments are at odds. Another example that's kind of close to my heart. SDG 10 is reduced inequalities. If 2 people on your team of 30 don't hold British passports, and you haven't appraised yourself of the Home Office rules and restrictions regarding right to work and leave to remain, and consider that when you're planning away days or travel for your team, then your personal convictions and your professional convictions are at odds. I probably got through this a little bit faster than I expected to, but nonetheless, I'm going to wrap up with a point that I hope drives the point home. It's an anecdote that I didn't realize had stayed with me for as long as it had, but it turns out it has scarred me deeply. I went to an interview for a comms contract at a fairly swanky UK university. I'm not going to say which one. I told the man conducting it that I had once helped to write and produce a jingle for one of my PR clients when I worked in Barbados. He asked me to sing it. I don't know, I suppose he wanted to know if I was telling the truth. So naturally, I balked. This was a position for maternity cover to run the comms department for a university that was going to be rolling out some fairly big projects coming up soon. I didn't think it was appropriate or relevant. So I balked, hoping that he was joking. But he pressed the point home and I was mortified. The woman sitting next to him said nothing. This man had no difficulty literally asking a Black woman to sing and dance in a professional setting without any consideration of its inappropriateness. He either didn't know or didn't care how, on a deeper level, it immediately conjures images of Josephine Baker dancing erratically and bare-chested to white audiences in Paris in a grotesque spectacle for their amusement. Often, the only work she and many other Black performers could get at the time. So if he is that bold and that clueless in a professional setting, how likely do you think it is he will be welcoming the news that his child perhaps is coming out as transgender, or is dating a Black man who talks and dresses like Stormzy or Burna Boy? My point, if it wasn't already clear, is that knitting diversity and inclusion into your policies in the workplace isn't like a jacket you put on at work and take off at home, or vice versa. Facing how you contribute to systems and structures that keep certain types of people out of our industry based on who they pray to, who they love, and whether they need their notes printed in Braille is the first step to dismantling those structures and rewriting a narrative in which the pupils of the Walter Mill Primary School have no reservations about pursuing communications and PR as a profession. Create a narrative in which they see leaders who look and sound like them as the norm, so that when they do gain access, they are not the first, they are not the only minority, and then have to carry the responsibility of all that that entails. When the Commonwealth Games are declared open next summer, I hope you are satisfied that the work you have already started with the CIPR's Race in PR report published last June reflects your willingness to accept and access the common wealth of diversity in all its forms, and that our industry is better off for it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Katrina. That was so thought-provoking. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now so that we can, there we are, so that we can see what questions we've got in the chat. This is your opportunity to speak to Katrina, to ask Katrina any questions, to perhaps pick her up on some of the points that she was making. And I can see already that Professor Claire Schofield, who is the director of the business school, has left you a message, Katrina, welcoming you to the school this evening and thanking you for the lecture that you've delivered to us today. Just while we are waiting for questions to come in, just something from me. Your experiences are quite brutal. I think it's fair to say that, you know, I've been quite shocked by your recounting of your experiences this evening, and I'm sure many of our other participants have been as well. Do you see any green shoots? Are you seeing any movement in the right direction in terms of changing some of those policies, changing some of those attitudes?
I do, and I'm glad you asked that, because I know that there's a risk always to come across as if you are a harbinger of doom. It isn't that. I do see green shoots. What I see is, while this may not be the most, how do I put this gently? It's not the best outcome, but it is an outcome that we can work with. So what we were talking about earlier was advancement. And while it's one thing to have a diverse uptake, you have to incentivize them to stay and guide them up the management path. If that is not happening, and it continues to not happen in some places, what we're seeing is an uptick in female comms entrepreneurs who will start their own consultancies. And while there are difficulties that come with it, they create a bespoke service to people who look and sound like them. And they're able also to thrive in an area where they are their own experts. And they're experts in a way that has nothing to do with their culture, their race, or their background. So from that perspective, out of the adversity that is not being able to advance and getting pushed back when your salary isn't increased when you think it should. What is creating is a greater drive for entrepreneurship among female comms directors to set up their own agencies, partner with like-minded allies, and give opportunities to people who do not necessarily have an in, whether it's knowing someone who knows someone. I mean, the reason why I'm talking to you is because I know someone that you know, kind of thing.
That's
So
true.
if you don't have that, I think that is pushing a new wave of female entrepreneurship. So I think that's definitely a green shoot.
Yes, yeah. Well, networking has always been part of the business, but it's how do we create those networks, which kind of leads to what I think is Amy's question. It's coming from the CIPR Midlands account, so I'm going to assume that's Amy Postle here with us this evening. Amy was saying that she's concerned that we pay lip service to diversity as a profession and we don't actually change the structures that are in place. And she says when she speaks with students, she wants to tell them that the system is changing and is opening up. But what advice should we give to students who don't actually see those role models?
Become them. That's not a tongue-in-cheek or a trite short answer. Obviously, work needs to happen, ground needs to be rolled, but there is a degree of boldness and tenacity that comes with the opportunity to carve your own path. I am quite accustomed to being the only person who looks like me in some of the spaces that I populate, but I no longer let that bother me because together we are often more than the sum of our parts. So the advice I'd give to students, if they're not coming to you, go to them. Be annoying, be tenacious. If no one looks like you, ask people who don't. And we're communicators, we tell stories, we should be able to create our own narratives. Punch down doors, get noticed, and more importantly, and that's something that I learned from another comms professional at the very beginning of my career, which I will never forget, which is create connections with people for no other reason than you find them interesting. The majority of the networking I do has very little to do with comms. Comms ends up being a happy consequence. Embolden your students to be the role models that they want to see, but to always keep someone in the background who can steer them, regardless of what they look like, because good advice does not only have to come from role models who mirror your cultural background, but be the role model that you want to see. And if you haven't the courage to do that yet, make yourself a nuisance to people you admire. I did it. And strangely enough, they're still talking to me. I don't know how.
That's great advice. That's great advice. Our next question comes from Claire Schofield, and she's asking us, are the barriers to a PR or comms career greater or lesser than wider business or professional careers in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion?
I can't speak for wider business because I'm not in it, but what I would say is I was surprised when I first moved back to the UK. And I say first moved back because I did uni here. I worked here at the Beeb for a little while, and then I went home to get some sun. And then I came back after a few years. So this is kind of like my second cohort of living in the UK. So that's about 3.5 years. And when I came back, I was shocked, genuinely, by the amount of insider knowledge I needed just to get my foot in the door of certain rooms, to say nothing of getting my seat at the table. I was surprised by it because, and please don't be offended, but we do a really good job of spinning yarns about who we are, and we're good at it for our clients as well. But there's sometimes a slip between cup and lip where delivering is concerned. So I can't speak to whether or not it's harder for other industries, but I know I found it difficult. And I know that others who are not as tenacious as I am, and others who have understandably thinner skin and are more easily more easily dissuaded, I think they would find it difficult. I mean, start to put the minority characteristics together. Bengali, English is your third language. You didn't study here. You're not wealthy. Where do you start? So I think that's where things like the UK Black Comms Network that I'm a part of, Black Women in Comms, which is another private group that I'm a part of, and quite a few allies who don't post Black squares and aren't always banging the drum, but quietly and consistently have pushed the agenda for people who need it to be given a platform. That's where those kinds of informal grassroots networks come in, I think. I hope that answers your question, Claire.
I'm going to say that yes, it does, because Claire can't interact with us on this forum. There's another question here around your thoughts on retention within the PR industry. If we can open these doors, how do we then keep people within the industry?
I said once in a podcast, and I didn't realize it was such a big deal at the time, that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's not a design flaw. Pardon me. I think you genuinely need to spend more time listening and learning before you start to create programs. And I think we're too quick to be self-congratulatory in our industry, especially considering that all we're doing is congratulating each other. There are these lists of 40 under, 30 under, 50 and who's who on top of this. And I'm not taking anything away from the people who have those accolades. Some of them are my friends and they've earned them by blood, sweat, and tears. However, we need to spend more time listening to the people who are not making those lists. One of the slides that I didn't get a chance to show talked about the number of companies who have committed to having listening sessions post George Floyd, and why some of them are not yet able to report on the figures of increased ethnic diversity in their staff. It's because they're taking the time to understand. So the direct answer to the question is pay attention and don't be offended if it doesn't work straight away. The degree of skepticism among ethnic minorities is about as high as it has been in the past quarter century. And you only have to have eyes and ears to know why. So take your time, listen and understand, be genuinely interested in what keeps these people incentivized, and make sure that when you make decisions that you include them. I can't believe we still have to say this. Stop making executive decisions for people without consulting them.
That is a really good point to make. Julia Clark has posted a question. She's asking, she's thanking you for your very compelling talk, and she was saying that she's struck by the parallels between the comms profession and higher education. Could you talk a little bit about how organisations bring policies to life? So, for example, we have a zero tolerance of racism as a policy, but feedback from students and staff is that that's not actually their lived experience. So how do we move from talking the talk to actually bringing these things into practice?
I want to start with a disclaimer. And I'm sorry to those who've heard me say this before, but unfortunately, I feel like I need to keep repeating it. Racism is not like weight. It's not like the COVID curves I've put on over the past year. You're not going to lose 20 pounds of racism with vigorous attention to detail in the next fortnight or in the next 2 years. This is, at least when it comes to Black people, this is 400 years of a structure that's designed to suit and benefit the descendants of slaveholders centuries after they died. No one is expecting you to come along and fix racism. But equally, sometimes I think we are trying too hard to look for obvious results. And perhaps, if I'm understanding Julia's question correctly, what we need to do is spend more time understanding how to measure the lived experiences of the people most affected by racism. So having a zero tolerance policy is fine, but what does it look like to have a zero tolerance policy when you are a hijabi wearing Muslim woman walking late at night from the chemistry lab? What does that actually mean? I think our metrics need to be more about how the person who is supposed to be protected views these policies, and less about the metrics that those imposing the policies believe are correct. I'm not particularly bothered by certain things that I think people think I should be, because I cut my teeth in a newsroom full of swarthy old men who didn't understand. Like, I had no choice but to get on with it because running to HR wasn't an option. But now, if my niece comes to me and says she feels uncomfortable, in her world, she has recourse. in her world, she has tangible examples of what zero tolerance to sexism looks like. So I think listen more to what it means to be protected rather than impose what you think they need.
Great. We have another question from Claire. She's asking, what could we do to actively support students and young professionals, the future PR comms professionals, to enter the profession when they're not actually seeing people that reflect them?
I believe I said this around slide 13, go where they are. I have this sick little image in my head of taking a particular kind of white man with a particular kind of demographic and shoving him in the front of a class of 16-year-olds at a university or at a college in Hackney, and making him uncomfortable and making him talk to them and making him understand where they're coming from. Because talking about the inability to attract talent is kind of old hat. If this year has taught us anything, it is that we are in an increasingly borderless world. And if you want to reach someone, you can. And that's why I talk about the inability to separate the personal from the professional, because if you're not willing to be uncomfortable in your personal life when it comes to facing the privilege that you benefit from, you're not going to be able to do it in your professional life when it comes to facing that your employees have a different experience from you. So I would say meet them where they are at. If you have never been to the fish and chip shop at the end of your street because your neighborhood is a little bit too swanky, stop there every other Friday and buy fish that you don't plan to eat. Talk to him. I mean, I've only lived here for a few months, and I happen to know that the security guard from Nigeria at my local Tesco's, his name is Winston. He very much loves his wife, and he likes jollof rice on Saturdays, because I take the time to get to know Winston, because you can be sure that if something happens to me in this neighborhood, it's Winston who's going to help me, not the store manager at Tesco. Sorry to be so personal, but it's the only way I can think to demonstrate that you need to go where they are. And if they're not coming to you, go there. And if I can understand why you wouldn't want to if you're of a particular demographic. It can be scary. It can be intimidating. So send an emissary. Every one of you now knows me. My DMs are open. You need Black folk? I can get you some.
Thank you. Amy's asking that she hears from a lot of people that they are exhausted fighting for a voice. So what's the role for allies as we move forward?
Oh, I love that question. The role for allies is to make space, make safe spaces. And the wonderful thing about the allies that I have is that you don't know them. And you don't know them because they don't need attention. You don't know them because they speak well of me when I'm not in the room. You don't know them because being an ally, despite or in the face of their own privilege, is something that's a lived experience for them. It's not something they put on like a jacket and take it off at home. So yes, we are tired. We've been tired, and we've been telling you we're tired for a long time now. So if you have the opportunity to recommend someone who has protected characteristics, do it. And be prepared to have someone look at you funny and wonder why you're rocking the boat. If you have the opportunity to engage with them on a level that centers their experience and not yours, do that. I don't really feel like going into an office in London to have a coffee, because that's going to cost me money and it's not my comfort zone. If a Black woman tells you she's going to get her hair done, more than likely it's going to be all day. Go to the salon, sit in the chair while she gets her braids done. Bring something she likes to eat. Talk to her where she's comfortable. I know these all sound very personal and trite, but they're the nuggets from which you can build out a degree of familiarity that makes it more comfortable for you to give voice where people don't feel like they have that agency. Make space. Speak up when they're not in the room. Speak well of them when they're not in the room. Stamp out and make a habit of educating yourself about things that they constantly complain about, but that you don't have skin in that game. Like I said, nobody knows who my allies are because they don't need to. They make space and they are enraged on my behalf. And if they have the power to change a structure, they do.
That's brilliant advice, and something that I think we can all try harder in our own behaviours and our own practice.
You know, it's not easy, and I'm not for a minute saying that these are things that are going to get solved in any short order, but you've got to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I applaud the CIPR for the Race and PR report. You've been very honest. You've, opened the books and said, this is who we are. This is our problem. 91% white is just too much white in an industry that claims to represent diverse voices. Fine. You've named it. Now you have to claim it. And always remember that your exhaustion over being faced with the race card pales in comparison to what it means to live it. And I'm not trying to bring out the tiny violin, but the reality is the figures show that it's not getting any better. What's getting better is the ability for people to create a degree of professional resilience that they shouldn't have to. The degree to which you are expected to create a professional phalanx that protects you from the minute you leave your house. Before you even sit at your desk, you're doing a series of psychological negotiations with spaces and places. You are subconsciously crossing the street. You're choosing different tube stations to go through. You're figuring out how to code switch based on if you're talking to the guard downstairs or the CEO that you meet in the lift. It's exhausting to have to be on high alert all the time. And it's also a trauma response. I'm not for one second saying that people who look like you, Sarah, don't have your own traumas, but yours aren't linked to what you look like.
No.
That's all. So every time you think, oh, not this again. Well, yes, this again. Because it was within living memory that the last time I went to deliver a keynote address, someone asked me to clear the table because they assumed I was the maid.
Wow. Okay, well, that's not going to be happening to you this evening.
No, I'm too cute to be the maid today.
Too cute. So we have thanks to you from Julia and also from Vita, and we have a question, and if anybody else has another question, I would encourage you to pop them in the chat now because we will be closing very shortly. But we have another question here from Amy asking, how do you think the workplace changes from the COVID pandemic are going to impact on inclusivity in the future?
I think people who are not comfortable with the office dynamic are going to thrive. I think introverts who have sensory issues, who don't feel at home in the office, are going to blossom. I feel like there will also be an opportunity for people to have more autonomy and agency over how they use their psychological energy with the work-life balance. Mm-hmm. I generally think that the inclusivity aspect will be changed based on choice. I'm aware that digital presenteeism is still very much a thing. It is probably why I'm still freelancing as we speak. But the people who still cleave to that model of being able to monitor their rank and file, their time is past, it's going. Mm-hmm. And the figures, as I said earlier, what is measured is noticed, and what's, that's handled. The figures will bear that out. If morale is low because you are henpecking and you pop, meetings in Teams and you Zoom call people in the middle of them trying to feed their child, you are going to get less and less compliance with regard to delivering with a willingness. You will end up getting foot soldiers. You will end up getting drones. You won't get people who are engaged. And I think it has to go both ways. Mm-hmm. The last time I went into the office, I was as happy as a clam because I got to talk to people. myself and a colleague were throwing a tennis ball backward and forward. We, threw ideas off of each other. It was great. But 2 days later, I was like, I do not need, let's call him Paul. I do not need Paul in my life today. And I happen to work quietly. I think the impact on inclusivity will come down to choice. It will come down to creating the space that you're most comfortable with in a professional setting. And once both boss and employee figure it out, I think we are going to emerge into a much kinder way of work. And I'm looking forward to it, honestly.
Yeah, me too. And I think actually as you're talking, it's made me wonder whether there are going to be impacts and consequences for the professionalisation of public relations. And I know we have another event on professionalisation coming up in our Sustainability of Comms Festival in the next couple of months. So that's perhaps something to pick up there. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your talk this evening, Katrina. There are nothing but positive comments in the feedback. With
I can see them.
Can you see them all? It's been really illuminating and fascinating and challenging, and I think it's what we all need from time to time to be challenged and to be able to be given a space to reflect on our own practice and the way in which we engage with colleagues. So thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and a great discussion afterwards. It's been lovely to have you, great to see you, and on behalf of everybody who's here with us, on behalf of the Director of the Business School and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Business and Social Science at the University of Wolverhampton, and on behalf of CIPR Midlands, I thank you very much indeed for your time here this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. And please, I know that the presentation itself ended a little bit abruptly, but I will leave it to the ever competent hands of Sarah, Claire, and Elena, I believe, who have been helping me with the logistics behind the scenes. Please make sure that if anyone wants to get in contact in terms of how to help, how to be a better ally, we are here. The UK Black Comms Network is here. The PRCA READ board is here. The blueprint is here. There's ways. If you don't know, we're here and we're willing to help, but we can't continue with the status quo as it is. So thank you all for listening. I'm assuming that someone will be baying for my blood shortly, but for now, I think I'm going to go speak to Winston up at my local Tesco and see what's on special today.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening at the University of Wolverhampton.
Oh, just a quick hello to Matthew Wilson, who's logged in from Geneva. And my friend Cam, who leads the UK Black Comms Network. I'm only now seeing the comments. It's very quiet over here by myself, Sarah.
I know. Actually, there's another question that I've just spotted, just quickly before you go, that Vita's posted. It popped up in a different question board. She's asking, there's been some discussion about encouraging name-blind recruitment. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yes and no. I mean, it's worth a try. I definitely believe that people's skills should be front and center. But do you know how they say that with every escalation of the drug crisis, for example, so if the police buy handguns, the drug runners buy AK-47s, and if the police have AK-47s, the drug runners buy RPGs. I think it's the same thing. If someone is invested in the idea of hiring in their own image, name-blind recruitment won't stop them for long. I know what it feels like, and my colleagues know what it feels like to go in only on skills and watch their faces of the recruiters change when they realize that it's somebody brown. And I'm not, the reality is these things happen. Yes, name-blind recruitment can definitely be a tool that's used to advance a fairer, more level playing field. But be careful that we aren't relying on it too much when the entire recruitment system needs to be overhauled from the perspective of bias. That's another talk that you can invite me to talk about.
Well, we certainly will. And thank you once again for your time this evening. And everybody, thank you very much for joining us. And we hope to welcome you at the next event in our calendar. Thank you.